This week's lecture is split into two different parts as we look at abused and abusive partners in understudied populations. This is chapter 10 in the Barnett text. And in order to start this, we're going to first look at the bigger picture of intimate partner violence in various cultures around the world. As the text says, violence against women stretches across the globe and has existed throughout history. Entire cultures permit or encourage violence against women. As we've talked about throughout the semester, the notion of patriarchy, that is, the privilege giving to males because they're males, is something that really is dominant all around the globe. There are a few matriarchal cultures that exist both within the United States and around the world in very special populations, but for the most part, our societies are structured with patriarchy as a basis for the relationships and between men and women and among people in general. And so the power structures within societies have long shaped our views on gender and on women and the roles and proper places of men and women in the world. And this plays out very significantly around the world when it comes to intimate partner violence. The recognition of the problem with cross-cultural intimate partner violence is not universal, however, as is indicated here. And in fact, in some respects, the United States seems to be leading the way in this topic as far as beginning to get a grip on intimate partner violence. One of the things that we find, especially among the less developed countries where economics are a larger issue, is that the lack of economic support correlates very strongly to male intimate partner violence. Immigrant status, whether it is into the United States or to other parts of the world, is associated with male assaultiveness as well. And this we'll be talking about some of the reasons why that may be the case. And of course, universally around the world, we find that alcohol is highly associated with domestic violence. Wars and civil unrest inflates the level of violence as well, and this sets the stage for additional or higher rates of intimate partner violence in among those countries and cultures. And then many cultures also nurture the pro-violence attitudes that encourage violence and set the stage for male partner violence. And this would certainly include our own culture as well, but it's even more prevalent in some of the less developed cultures of the world. There's legal protection issues as far as male partner violence is concerned, and gender inequality, of course, plays a major role in all of this. Women are as likely or more likely than men to believe that wife beating is justified. That's an interesting factor here, that oftentimes the acceptance of male dominance and the acceptance of the submissive role of females in many cultures is as strongly espoused by the females as it is by the males. I have read it in the past one time, or more than once actually, that one of the factors that inflamed Osama bin Laden and his campaign against America goes back to the time when we first invaded Iraq in 1991. And prior to that time, in preparation for that assault on the country, we established bases in Saudi Arabia. And in those traditional Middle Eastern cultures where women are cast to a very submissive role, they don't go outside without burqas on, covering their faces, and they don't have roles equal to men, much less roles that put them in leadership over men. When American military came to the Middle East and established itself, and women were ingrained in the fighting units and in the bases and were given significant roles in those bases, it was considered to be an insult to the cultural traditions. According to the traditionalists in those cultures, it was considered something of an insult, and that is one of the reasons. So I have read that kind of set the stage for some of the anger that the Muslim world has against the United States, and that has been playing out in the last 10 or 15 years. That's just an interesting thing to ponder, and again, it kind of does reflect again the sense that our sensibilities and our perceptions of how the gender should relate to each other, and the notions that gender equality and egalitarianism is something that we should work towards, isn't universally accepted by any stretch of the imagination around the world. And in fact, I think it's safe to say those notions are rejected by many cultures. We believe that to be behind the time, kind of archaic, to not accept that, but I would venture to say that the majority of individuals around the world believe that males should be in a dominant position. And some of this is the fundamentalist dogma that connects to some of the religions. Christian religion as well has passages that individuals will point to that supposedly support the notion that men should be in charge. But there are also other dogmas and other religions around the world that further support not only that separation between the genders, but also that's really rests at the core of some of the attitudes that lead to the violence against women around the world. Now, just to step back a minute, a basic sociological concept. Well, something that's not on the slide here that I want to first mention to you is the term of ethnocentrism. Ethno being, of course, ethnic, or those particular ethnic groups, and centrism being seeing yourself as the center of things. And so ethnocentrism is the tendency that anyone has, not only the Americans, but anyone around the globe, the tendency to see one's own culture as sort of the model and the ruler, so to speak, that other cultures are measured against. And so if we see things in, say, Middle Eastern culture that don't make sense as compared to our own culture, we believe that those attitudes and beliefs in the other culture are somehow inferior to ours or backwards socially, those kinds of things. Again, for instance, the concept of male superiority, of patriarchy, where we believe more in egalitarianism in this culture than perhaps any culture in the world. I'm sure there are a few exceptions to that, but so we tend to see other countries who have not kind of got to that point where males and females should be treated equally as being backwards. That's an ethnocentric view about patriarchy and about gender roles and those kinds of things. Cultural relativism is the I don't know if it's the opposite of ethnocentrism, but it is certainly at the another end of the spectrum, which says that really we don't have a right to judge other cultures based upon our own cultures as being the norm. That is only true for us and not for other cultures. And so in order to understand what goes on in other cultures, to understand the behaviors and attitudes and beliefs of persons in other cultures, we have to accept those beliefs, those cultures, and to study them within the context of that culture itself. You can't take American standards and apply it to the Middle East, for instance. So, as the text says, a society cannot intrude on another simply because it has different attitudes and practices about marriage, child rearing, and education. What an American feminist would call abuse, an Asian male may call teaching a woman how to be a good wife. And in order to really study and understand the behaviors and beliefs and attitudes, and ultimately then to be able to help individuals from other cultures, we have to first be able to be willing to look at those other cultures and understand that within the context of their own world, this is normal, this is right. So, of course, the dilemma then is when we have, not only our striving for egalitarianism among the genders, but also just a sense of human rights. Jimmy Carter, when he was president, really kind of brought that to the fore. In fact, that many nations around the world really did a horrible job with human rights, and really irritated a lot of other leaders around the world because of his kind of moralistic stance in that area. The question is then, how do we integrate our beliefs about human rights with the concept of cultural relativism? relativism when it comes to women's rights around the world. And that's just one of those dynamic issues. Our Secretary of State during the first Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, had begun to champion the causes of women's rights around the world and speeches in China and things like this. And so it is a very sensitive issue, even if it seems something to us that is obvious and shouldn't be debated. So looking at some of the forces around the globe, so to speak, we'll first take a look at Africa. And I have to tell you, this text, there are so many different studies. Some are individual studies, some are their larger studies, some are short-term, some are longitudinal. And there are little differences in one population as compared to another. It isn't possible to put all of those details into any kind of a lecture or PowerPoint presentation that wouldn't take all day and lose you in all the details, and I'm sure bore the listener to death sitting there with your eyes on this slide and hopefully in listening to me. So really, I'm just picking up some of the points. I'm not even sure they're the highlights. They're some of the things that I thought were the highlights when I read through it, but they may not actually be the highlights the authors intended. But so for each of these populations throughout this lecture, please understand that I can only pick out some points from it and can't get them all. And perhaps if you have read the chapter, you may think that I'm missing some important things, and that's very possible. So as far as in Africa goes, African cultures, it's a broad range of female behaviors that are cited as justification for violence. And some of the African societies, particularly I think those more to the north, are what we refer to as honor societies, where again a woman's behavior reflects upon the male, and so the males then can do violent things leading up to and including murdering women for certain behaviors, and that it's accepted in that society. One generation after another witnesses violence in that society, and so that is another thing that contributes to the interpersonal violence and intimate partner violence in Africa. African cultures, many of them practice habits or procedures such as forced early marriages, polygamy, and attitudes there sometimes they don't lend themselves towards seeing women as equal and do set them up in sometimes violent relationships with men. Ghana is one exception that the text talks about, where there is a more egalitarian decision making in among married couples, and with that there is a reduced incidence of male battering in that, and that's something we'll see reflected in a few other spots this week, that the more equal the relationships are viewed in a culture or within a group, the less battering tends to be present. And so that does reflect, I think, the patriarchal attitudes are really one of the things that very firmly underlie the prevalence of intimate partner violence in male-female relationships. There's also a theory here that, which is also, I think, very valid, this imbalance theory, that when one partner has more resources like income or more power because of patriarchy than the other partner, that partner violence increases. So patriarchy is one of those things. Income accessibility is also another thing that contributes in that regard. When we look to Asia, and we'll have a couple slides on Asia, in many of those cultures, women lack the very basic human rights concerning their own bodies. Korean women were studied in one population and were said to be more likely to stay with abusive husbands for several reasons, and many of these reasons in one form or another spread across many different cultures in Asia, not just Korea. The concept that family members should stick together, that it's the wife's responsibility to care for her family and to sacrifice her own desires on behalf of her family. And this is certainly not something that's restricted. That particular thing is certainly not restricted to Asian families, but it may be more prevalent there. And that a wife's first priority is to be obedient to her husband and never talk back. Years ago, when I was working as a therapist at the mental health center here in our little town, I worked with a young man who had been was born in Korea but had been adopted here some years later, but had obviously spent some time studying his culture and knew some things of his culture. And I was preparing for a trip to China, in fact, to the Far East for a 3-week tour with a mental health delegation, and I can remember this young man telling me that I should make it a point to stop in Seoul on the way back and get a Korean woman and bring her back with me, because Korean women do everything the men tell them to do, and that's reflected of some of the traditional thinking about men and women in Korea that the text talks about. In India, we're in that part of the globe where we also hear a lot about arranged marriages, and this is very much still active in I believe in Indian cultures. The concept of we marry, we have what they're called love marriages, where we select our own partner because we fall in love. But many of the less industrialized cultures and the more traditional cultures still use arranged marriages, where parents essentially select the spouses for their children. Dowries are exchanged for the women, those kinds of things. And so in this culture, then young women obey all men, and men can often beat their younger wives at will. In Nepal, which is probably a more primitive culture in the way that we think, at least, menstruating women are seen as unclean and are sent out to live in shacks separate from the rest of society. Oftentimes, when in that culture, women prepare the food and serve the men first, and they get only what's left. Again, just some reflective of some ideas about the role of men and women and how we relate to each other around the world. Southern Asia is rife with poverty, and that is certainly something that contributes to the violence in families. In Bangladesh, acid throwing is used when women have dishonored or have angered men. They throw acid in the faces of their wives to disfigure them as punishment, and this is something that is accepted in traditional culture there. Jealousy seems to play particularly strong in China. Traditionally, families should not be interfered with in China. China has also a cultural concern about saving face, which is something that we'll touch on here in a bit as well. The notion that no one should put another person in well, let me see how I put this, that another person should not be denied something by another person because of the sense that is shameful to the individual that's denied things. And so by saving face, this is something that's very important in this culture, where we not put another person down. And interestingly, that doesn't necessarily apply with males to females in their relationships, but it does suggest that when women do things wrong, in the eyes of Chinese men, perhaps that shames men, so something to keep in mind. Here they talk about how in the Vietnamese culture, both males and females support gender inequality and believe that that's the proper way of things. And in some of the Afghani cultures in Asia, or the Muslim cultures in Asia, such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, the Muslim faith really underlies a lot of their attitudes about women. Women's movement from one place to another restricted very much. Of course, they are not to go outside. Well, in some cultures, not to go outside without a close relative male with them. They are to stay inside otherwise. They always keep their faces covered. In fact, no skin is supposed to show in some cultures. No school, no work. And in fact, if in many cultures, if they deny men sexual desires, they can be denied basic things such as food. Moving on to Middle Eastern cultures, the human rights abuses against women are rampant, and this is probably an objective measure as well as an ethnocentric statement. the man's honor depends a lot upon the woman's public behavior. So when a woman does do anything that is outside the norm, men have license to beat or maim or murder the women in their lives in order to correct that problem. You see here that it says that in Egypt there are cultural traditions that indicate that beating your wife is justified. Israel has pro-violence attitudes, which tend to contribute to wife beating. However, it's interesting, the kibbutz, which, if you are not familiar with the kibbutz concept, that in Israeli culture, this was sort of an experiment that was begun in Israel, that involved the community raising children. Essentially, it takes daycare but to new heights, where children really spend their entire day being raised in a group with individuals who are hired to care for those children, and only come home at night to sleep with their parents. And so they're raised by the community in this sort of communal parenting kind of thing, and they're interestingly, their violence against women is almost unheard of in that setting. Again, I think there's a lot of gender equality also conveyed in the kibbutz culture. In Europe, efforts and responses to intimate partner violence across the continent continue to lag some behind the United States, but I believe are probably certainly closer than they are in other parts of the world. Individuals there still continue to have this sense that they're not really recognizing the reason why women stay with abusive husbands, and believe that they could simply leave their abusive partners. Now, in cultures where, in Europe, of course, there are more social services readily available to everyone. European cultures have more of and this is something that you have heard sometimes in the presidential campaigns in the last decade or so, about the supposed socialist leanings of the Democratic candidates and things. That this really is reflects some of the European thinking that in government, which does have a bit more of a socialist kind of flavor to it, in the sense that, not because they're communist, but in the sense that they believe more in the government providing for the needs of all individuals in society without stigma, and there are many good things about that from a social work perspective, certainly. And so what I'm trying to say here is, in terms of Europe, the fact that services may be more readily available may make it harder for individuals still to understand why women stay with abusive partners. In Russia, not as much research in this topic. I think, and this is something of a stereotype, but we kind of tend to associate alcohol with Russians and that kind of thing. And certainly there are problems with alcoholism in that society that increase the risk as far as intimate partner violence is concerned. Again, intergenerational transmission of domestic violence in that. And Russia does have some of the living facilities, I think, because of their economy and everything, tend to be kind of communal in nature. And this is one thing that the text points out, that those individuals living in these more communal kind of living facilities tend to be somewhat protected from intimate partner violence, and there seems to be less of that in those kinds of communities. Latin America has a lot of patriarchal practices, and there is this kind of machismo kind of philosophy, this idea of the strong, dominant male, very sexual kind of thing. Now, I believe a lot of persons from Hispanic and Latin American cultures will tell you that we really place in America, that we place far too much emphasis on the importance of machismo in the culture, that they're not as single-minded as that, to believe that that powerful sexual men should rule the world and have their way with women. But anyway, there's The text certainly points to this philosophy that underlies a lot of thinking in Latin America, apparently, and also a tendency to lean towards authoritarian family structure in those cultures, which are then all these things are, as we've talked about throughout the semester, tend to be pretty strong contributors to male to female violence and intimate partner violence. In some cultures, women in Latin America, I think they said 12 different cultures, in fact, that rapists can exonerate themselves by marrying the woman they've raped, and that the victim is actually pressured to marry the rapist as something that she should do. And it talks a little bit also specifically about Mexico and some studies that were done there. It shows that women who are abused by their husbands when they're living with their in-laws, sometimes they're viewed very unfavorably and are blamed for the abuse. So that social ties that we tend to rely upon, sometimes family in instances of domestic violence, for instance, those social ties may not be as supportive in those cultures. And this says that the United States, Canada, and Greenland have begun to recognize male-to-female intimate partner violence as a social problem. We can hope so. I'm still not convinced that we have a sense that this is a problem that needs to be dealt with consistently. I believe that we're at a historical point right now where we're acknowledging this. The question is whether or not our cultures will be able to make any permanent moves in that direction before the whole idea of domestic violence and male to female intimate partner violence is kind of swept under the rug again by patriarchy, which has been the tendency, as we've talked about in the last few weeks, has been the tendency throughout our history about intimate partner violence being discovered and rediscovered, I believe. So that would be the first part of this week's lecture. The second part will talk about special populations, and so after you've taken a break, come back and take a listen to that as well.